YouTube. Today we
We'll
have
take those and
Samuel
pass them
Elliott,
down,
who's
and
going to talk about General Hooker's assault
there's
at Rossville Gap.
one,
So we'll get started here in just a
got
few
two
minutes.
there,
So we appreciate you
two
tuning in.
there. So if
and,
y'all will,
we'll get started. Thanks.
And then let's see.
Oh, I brought my glasses for a reason.
Well, you can. Hopefully, you can at least remember it. And
It's not hard, it's just, thank you.
and I ran out of the. So I've got those.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, sir.
Let me give you that.
Thank you.
Let's see. I'm going to give you three more, if you don't mind. There you go, Mike. No, pass them down that way.
Okay, I'm gonna give them one, but I have mine.
Oh, okay.
My book's outside. Thank you.
There you go. Right in time.
Thank you. Just barely.
Jeff, I'm going to set these here so when you have other people come in. You can see the notebook that I have.
I saw that. That looks like a lot of fun reading.
Oh, yeah.
You know, Will, Vice Mayor of Spring Hill, he knows all about it.
Oh, yeah. I'm not gonna gripe about it because that's how I make my living. So. Over 50 years, it's about doubled.
That's enough to deal with.
Yeah, not quite. And I've been their attorney for 36 of the 50, so. Trying to hang on to make it 40 and before I quit, but I don't know that I'm going to.
Well, you want to tell us about the strategic and tactical advantage of default?
Of what?
You want to tell us about the strategic and tactical advantages that General Ford
Yeah,
considered?
we're going to talk about it.
Okay, good.
And if not, ask a question about it.
I'm sorry.
And if I don't touch on it, then you ask a question about it at the end because I don't have time for questions.
Okay. I always hesitate to do that because I'm not trying to test.
Well, don't worry. Don't worry. I'm at the age I don't mind saying I don't know. Yeah.
All righty.
Ran
How's
from
everybody doing
Kingsport.
today? Good. Yeah, it's good to see some familiar faces, some new faces as well. So thank y'all so much for coming out for the Franklin Civil War Roundtable. We'll go ahead and get started here in just a second. So a couple things just for our next speaker, which is going to be October 12th. It's going to be Tom Price. He's going to talk about Maury County during the Civil War. So be sure to, if you can make it out, we'd be glad to have you out here. Before I introduce our speaker, I do want to take just a second to encourage a little bit of kindness, because I think that's something we all need right now. And this is something that Greg did, and I've seen him do several times. And so feel free to take a second, stand up, introduce yourself to your neighbor, and just get to know your neighbor real quick. And we'll take a second to do that, and we'll get started here in just a second. But I think it's important for us to always take the opportunity to meet new folks and to enjoy each other's company. So.
I know you. I'm Sam Elliott.
Long Nash.
Nice to meet you.
Likewise.
Sam Elliott. Dave Christie. Nice to meet you.
All righty. All right. Well, thank y'all so much for indulging me in that. I do appreciate it. All right. So I will go ahead and introduce our speaker today. His name is Sam Elliott. He is a noted Civil War historian with primary focus on Tennesseans during the Civil War era, an author of several books, including Soldier of Tennessee, General Alexander P. Stewart, and the Civil War in the West, Dr. Quintard, Chaplain, and the second Bishop of Tennessee, Isham G. Harris of Tennessee, and John C. Brown of Tennessee. Sam is also a practicing attorney working at Peters, Elliott, and Cannon. In 1978, he received the Bachelor of Arts degree from Sewanee, the University of the South. Then entered the University of Tennessee, graduating with a Juris Doctor degree in 1981. He is the former president of both the Tennessee Bar Association and the Chattanooga Bar Association. Sam is listed in the publication Best Lawyers in America for Bet the Company litigation, commercial litigation, land use and zoning litigation, litigation municipal and municipal law. In addition, he has been selected as Mid-South Super Lawyer every year since 2006 and is AV Preeminent rated in, oh my gosh, I can't pronounce some of these words, Martindale-Hubbell. Moreover, Sam is a recipient of several awards, including the Chattanooga Bar Association, Ralph H. Kelly Humanitarian Award, Justices Brock and Cooper American Inns of Court Civility Award, and Legal Aid of East Tennessee Chief Justice William M. Barker Equal Access to Justice Award. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to our speaker, Samuel Elliott.
Thank you. Is this thing working? Can everybody hear me? Yeah. What is it you just learned about me? I'm a lawyer who wrote a book. I'm not a historian. I'm a lawyer who wrote a book. But no, I'm very pleased to be back here with the Franklin Roundtable. It's been quite a while since I've been over this direction and the Roundtable since. This is my third trip to Franklin this year, so I do feel like I've caught up on what's going on over here. I originally thought that I would work up a talk on Spring Hill. I did a biography of A.P. Stewart, who had a role at Spring Hill. I did a biography of John C. Brown, who had a role at Spring Hill, and I did a biography of Isham G. Harris, who was a witness at Spring Hill and was going back and forth among the officers and everything. And then I thought, no, if I start talking about Spring Hill, then I'm going to be in a room full of people who know all about Spring Hill, and therefore I might not meet your expectations. And so, as I said to my friend Dan Pomeroy, I decided to retreat to Missionary Ridge. And so we're going to talk. We're going to talk about Missionary Ridge today. And I don't know, have everyone been to Chattanooga, more or less? Has anyone been to Civil War sites in Chattanooga? Do we have a pretty good idea where Missionary Ridge is relative to the city and all that sort of stuff? I've got a map, and the best way to describe Missionary Ridge is that it, from the Tennessee and Georgia line, which is the area we're going to be talking about today, it extends about 7 miles to close where South Chickamauga Creek empties into the Tennessee River. So you can't see any of this. I can tell it's dark in here and everything else, but you can see this line of red right here, and that's the Confederate line on Missionary Ridge on November 25th, 1863. That's the day, ma'am. Well, those maps that you have are derived from this map, which is the official Army map of the Chattanooga campaign, okay? So I've put it on the ground for you, and as you can see, the maps that you have are designated as times. There's one map for November 24th, 1863 to show you where General Stewart's line was that day, and then the remaining maps, 1 o'clock, 4 o'clock, and 5 o'clock on November 25th, 1863. Okay, so everybody straight on that? All right, and what we're going to talk about today is what I call the Battle of Rossville Gap. It's an aspect of the Battle of Chattanooga that has gotten little attention in the standard histories of the battle. The result of this lack of attention is basically to obscure what could have been the most decisive fighting of November 25th, 1863, the day of the battle, the final day of the Battle of Chattanooga, with a potential for a greater return for the Union than even what they had when they broke through the Confederate lines on Missionary Ridge that day, and a greater disaster for the Confederacy. Why is there so little attention to this battle? Well, there's little source material for one. The Confederate reports for that end of the battle were missing for many years, to the extent that the Park Commission itself had an imperfect understanding of what occurred in 1896. The Confederate reports were found at the Georgia Historical Society in the early or mid-1990s. I was bemoaning to Jim Ogden, who I'm sure has spoken to you before. He's the historian at the Chickamauga National Military Park, that there were no Confederate reports, and he said, well, they've recently been found down at the Georgia Historical Society in Savannah. And I happened to be going to Charleston just about 2 weeks later, so I managed to go by and see them, and they were there, the originals. Probably General Stewart's copy. He was wounded in an aspect of the Battle of Atlanta at Ezra Church in 1864 and recuperated in Savannah, and it's possible that his reports and everything ended down there at that time. At any rate, on the Union end, the reports survived, but lost some of their content when not read with, some of their context when not read with the Confederate reports. If I'm allowed to speculate, I would say there are other reasons. First, the main commanders on either side of the battle were somewhat out of favor at different times afterwards. John C. Breckinridge left the Army of Tennessee only weeks later, and Joe Hooker, the Confederate commander, if he ever was in favor, fell out of favor as a Western commander in the summer of 1864. No one on the rebel side wanted to claim responsibility, and no one on the federal side wanted to give Hooker credit. And the action, which included a massive federal force against a very small Confederate force, paled in dramatic nature with the Army of the Cumberland's spontaneous assault on Missionary Ridge. That's the main story of Missionary Ridge, where they advanced as sort of a distraction against the Confederates, because the main attack is on the northern end of Missionary Ridge, and the Army of the Cumberland gets there, getting shot at, and spontaneously these four divisions climb the ridge and overwhelm the Confederates and drive them off of Missionary Ridge. Now, to understand this action on November 25th, we need to understand the geography of Missionary Ridge, and we've already talked about that. It's a 7 mile long, more or less, and it's not a solid rampart, like if you watch the Game of Thrones and there's a big ice rampart and that sort of thing. It's more like scoops of ice cream crammed on top of one another, all the way up and down Missionary Ridge of that 7-mile aspect. And that's important in the story of Missionary Ridge, not necessarily for our story, but because of those scoops of ice cream, as you can think, there are draws and things of that nature which make it possible to attack up the ridge. The Tennessee portion of the ridge extends almost due south to the state line, just south of which is a narrow gap at what is known as Rossville, Georgia. And it's called Rossville because it was named after, or the home of John Ross, who was an Indian chief, a Cherokee Indian chief, who eventually went to Oklahoma with his tribe in the 1830s. But he was a well-known person at that time, and his house still survives there in Rossville. It's been moved out of the gap a little bit because of the construction of a highway and things like that. Okay. Our focus then is the Battle of Rossville Gap and the Narrow there. I've made some notes here and I've confused myself. If you look at the map, the 1 p.m. map, just for a moment, and the troop movements, ignore the troop movements on the 1 p.m. map. But if you'll look, you can see how Missionary Ridge extends down to the Tennessee line, and you can clearly see the Tennessee-Georgia line, and then how Missionary Ridge continues just south of that line. And so that helps orient you, I guess, as to where we are on the state line and how Missionary Ridge runs. The story of the Battle of Rossville Gap really starts in the hours after the Federal retreat from Chickamauga on September 20th, 1863. The Lafayette Road, which is the main north-south road over which the armies fought at Chickamauga, passes through the Rossville Gap into Chattanooga. And you can see that showing up on the 1 p.m. map. There's a road that kind of extends from the gap down to the south and to the east a little bit. That's the Lafayette Road that eventually runs through the Chickamauga battlefield. It is therefore the main route of the victorious Confederate Army of Tennessee's advance on Chattanooga after the battle, and it is therefore a place that the Federal Army intends to hold, at least as a delaying position. Elements of several federal divisions, again, if you'll look at this 1 o'clock map, you can see how if you can imagine, there are lines that are drawn to defend this gap by the Federal Army, but the gap defense is towards the east, not towards the west, which is what the Confederates would have wanted to do. So their entrenchments are aligned to keep an assault from coming in from the east. And eventually they abandon these lines as they're subject to being flanked further up the ridge as the position in Chattanooga by that time is prepared for defense. The Confederates move forward, and they eventually occupy Lookout Mountain and stretch their line from a picket line in Lookout Valley east across the mountain, then across Chattanooga Valley. And if you go back and look at the November 24th file, you can see that Rossville Gap itself is not fortified. Instead, there's a line running across what we call Chattanooga Valley because Chattanooga Creek runs through it into the Tennessee River from the south. The Federals, and that stays that way until late October when the Federals are able to open up Lookout Valley. After that happens, the Federals are able to move strong reinforcements into the Chattanooga area, while at the same time, in the first couple of weeks in November, Bragg actually weakens his army. Everyone remembers that Longstreet is sent up to Knoxville in an effort to not only take Knoxville, but also to get Longstreet out of Bragg's hair. And we know about that too. But because of the federal reinforcements, he gets reinforcements from under Sherman from Mississippi. There's troops from the Army of the Potomac under Joe Hooker, who we've already talked about, coming down from the eastern section. And so the Army of the Cumberland is reinforced until the whole federal force is approximately 70,000 men. Bragg has about 35,000 infantry in 8 divisions. Grant's original plan for the Battle of Chattanooga was to use his former army, which is Sherman's men, the Army of the Tennessee, under his most trusted subordinate, Sherman, to attack the northern end of Missionary Ridge, that jumble of hills at the very end of the ridge. Right behind that area where Sherman's going to attack is the main Confederate supply base for the army besieging Chattanooga, Chickamauga Station. And you can see it today by going to the Chattanooga airport and standing in the parking lot, because that's where Chickamauga Station was at that time. And that's an important place because not only is it the main Confederate supply base, but it's also puts Grant between across the railroad down to Atlanta, where the Confederates are reviving their supplies, and cuts Bragg off from Longstreet in Knoxville on the railroad up to Knoxville. So it's an important place, and as much as Bragg is criticized, he knows that. He can deduce it. The Army of the Cumberland and the men of the Army of the Potomac Detachment were to make diversionary attacks from Chattanooga itself. But as Hooker observed to one of his staff officers in connection with this, Dan Butterfield, and everyone knows who Dan Butterfield was if you're Civil War aficionados, man proposes and God disposes. Heavy rains break the pontoon bridge over the Tennessee River, stranding 3 divisions in Lookout Valley and other side on the west side of Lookout Mountain with Hooker. So he has 3 divisions instead of 1, and his diversion against Lookout Mountain turns into a large attack that takes the mountain on November 24th, 1863, which is the famous Battle Above the Clouds at Lookout Mountain. And if you've been to Point Park at Lookout Mountain, there's this magnificent painting that Hooker commissioned, showing him in the middle of it on his white Charger, and his men are attacking Lookout Mountain, and he's there supervising it all. It's a great painting. Braxton Bragg makes the decision late in the day to abandon Lookout Mountain because Hooker's taking it. He orders a brigade of Alabama men, Henry D. Clayton's brigade, or we'll just call it Clayton's brigade from now on, who in the absence of Clayton is commanded by Colonel James T. Holtzclaw, up on the mountain from Chattanooga Valley to cover the retreat of the rebels on the mountain. Holtzclaw and his brigade get up on the mountain, which is actually on the shelf where the Craven's house is today, and they're up there until about 2 or 3 the next morning. They skirmish with the Yankees off and on that clear moonlit night, and observers on Missionary Ridge or in the valley can see the flickering of the gunfire there on Lookout Mountain. Eventually the Confederates leave, and there is a fortuitous eclipse of the moon that allows them to get away unmolested, although they, like a lot of soldiers in the Chattanooga area, both Federal and Confederate, because of their diet deficiency, there had been a lot of rains, and of course the Federals were more or less besieged. The Confederates had a tough supply line and everything. There was a lot of night blindness in the soldiers around Chattanooga at that time because the vitamin deficient, there was a vitamin A deficiency, and so they had a tough time seeing at night, but they were able to get off the mountain. And like I said, Braxton Bragg, notwithstanding all of the criticism against him, is not a fool. He knows that Chickamauga Station is an important place for his army, and so he takes steps to prepare for that. He has a meeting that night with his 2 corps commanders. One of his corps commanders is William J. Hardee, who was not here at Franklin, and of course John C. Breckinridge, the former Vice President of the United States, who also was not here at Franklin. But they are in command of these 8 divisions that are stretched along the mountain. They all 3 recognize that the Army of Tennessee is in peril. The Yankees have at least double their army. While the rains that broke the bridge and made the Tennessee River higher are there, they also also raised the level of South Chickamauga Creek, which is immediately behind Missionary Ridge. And so they're in deep, you know what, as the case may be. And so all three, because of that, Hardy thinks that the Army should retreat. But Breckinridge argues that Missionary Ridge is an inherently strong position and his blood is up because it was his wing that was driven off of Lookout Mountain that day. He also argues that it's too late for the Army to retreat and get away before daylight. Bragg agrees and decides to stay. The two divisions that are on Lookout Mountain, Cheatham's and Stevenson's, are moved all the way across and up to the very northern end of Missionary Ridge to counter Sherman's attack up there, anticipated attack up there. 5 of Bragg's 8 divisions are concentrated on the northern 1/3 of the ridge. The remaining 3 cover the other 2/3. And we're talking about basically a 4.5 mile line with 3 divisions, 3 pretty small divisions at that point too. The remaining, in retreating from Lookout Mountain, also the line across Chattanooga Valley, and again, that's map 1, there's that line across Chattanooga Valley, is moved up on, Stewart's division is moved up on Missionary Ridge. And actually, it's interesting, it's only in the last 2 or 3 days before the Battle of Missionary Ridge that the Confederates actually occupy Missionary Ridge as a defensive position. Before that time, they were stretched out in rifle pits at the foot of Missionary Ridge and not use it because they didn't expect that the Federals there would try to break out of Missionary Ridge. But when it became obvious that they were going to stay and they needed that position, they moved up to the top of the ridge. And in the context of that, you see what you sometimes see with the Army of Tennessee. Anyone been to Kennesaw Mountain? Cheatham's Hill? Yeah, Cheatham's Hill, or the top of Shies Hill, just up the road here. The Army of Tennessee has trouble distinguishing between the geographic crest of a hill and the military crest of a hill. And does anyone know what the difference is? The military crest of the hill is the highest point on the hill where you can shoot all the way down. The geographic crest is the actual part of the height of the hill, but if you're on the geographic crest, it might be that and this is true at Bragg Reservation on Missionary Ridge, you don't see at the very top of the hill, you don't see all the way down. You just see a little ways down and then the ridge drops all the way down. And so in the confusion there, a lot of the Confederate lines are placed on the geographic crest, and that eventually causes some problems. General Stewart's division moves from Chattanooga Valley up onto the ridge itself. And on November 25th, Stewart is given a number of orders that shift his troops up and down the ridge and detach and reattach one of his brigades from his command. Stewart has the unenviable task of the defense of the Confederate left. One of his brigades, Straw's Tennessee Brigade, is ordered to occupy a 3-tiered system of trenches and rifle pits at the bottom of the ridge, another set part of the way up, and a line at the top of the ridge. And why he was ordered to do that, I'm not really sure. I don't know why that was a sensitive place. His remaining troops are deployed in a single line along the ridge as far down as they would stretch, which is just to the south of Breckinridge's headquarters. If you'll look at the 1 p.m. map, you'll see where Breckinridge's headquarters was. Okay, so Stewart's line does not extend all the way to Rossville Gap. And that's an important consideration here. To cover Rossville Gap, the key to Confederate left on that part of the ridge, Stewart is told to detach 2 regiments and a battery to that point. Incidentally, here's a place where the newly discovered reports indicate the Confederate markers on the ridge are wrong. The 2 regiments indicated on the markers to be from Clayton's brigade, but actually there are 2 regiments of exchanged Vicksburg prisoners from Stovall's Georgia Brigade, the 42nd and 43rd Georgia, which were dispatched down to Rossville Gap because they were the 2 largest regiments of Stovall's brigade. These two regiments, together just over 600 men, are basically stationed on an island over a mile from the rest of Stuart's line. And if you look again at the 1 p.m. map, you'll see what I'm talking about. You can see where that one line of Confederate, red line of Confederate troops are, and then the rest of the Confederate line. There was also a little bit of confusion on the Federal side that morning, but by 10 a.m., Hooker has his column of 3 divisions on the road from Lookout Mountain across Chattanooga Valley to Rossville. These are small divisions too, but Hooker still has about 10,000 men moving towards the Confederate left and the Confederate rear. The lead division is a division, again, Stovall's men were from Vicksburg. These are Vicksburg veterans under Peter J. Oosterhouse, a German-born brigadier general. Oosterhouse finds that the rebels have destroyed the bridge over Chattanooga Creek, and so he sends a regiment, the 27th Missouri, over on a rude footbridge that could be built and to scout ahead. The 27th moves forward to engage the Georgians at Rossville Gap in heavy skirmishing that goes on about 2 hours, while Hooker's main body repairs the bridge and crosses Chattanooga Creek. About 1 p.m., and again this map 2, or the 1 p.m. map, describes what we're talking about. The impasse is finally broken when Oosterhouse's division comes forward, 1 brigade, Woods, advancing up the Missionary Ridge on the south side of the gap, and you can see that depicted here. And then another brigade, Williams's, advancing up the ridge on the north or Tennessee side of the gap. The 2 Georgia regiments are basically flanked out of the gap, but instead of marching north to let General Stuart, General Breckinridge, General Bragg don't know what's going on, as you can see from the arrow there on the 1 p.m. map, they march off to the east. Bragg and Breckinridge can look. Hooker is, at this point, just after 1 p.m. on November 25th, Hooker is in control of Rossville Gap. And the Confederate High Command doesn't quite know it yet because these men went off to the east rather than went back north to the main Confederate line. Bragg and Breckinridge could look across the valley from their spots on Missionary Ridge and see Hooker's long column snaking towards Rossville from Lookout Mountain. Not hearing from the Georgians at Rossville, the 2 commanders decided that Breckinridge should detach a brigade from Stuart. And remember, Stuart's already spread out pretty thin on top of the mountain, or on top of the ridge, and go on a reconnaissance towards Rossville. You're making a reconnaissance towards a very sensitive place that you should have had covered anyway. And so Breckinridge goes personally with them. Clayton's brigade, the same Alabama men who covered the retreat from Lookout Mountain to the early hours of that morning, is chosen for that task. There's about 1,500 men in Clayton's brigade. So we already know that the 600 men from Stovall's men have been driven off to the east. We know that the Federals have about 10,000 men, and here goes 1,500 men down to Rossville on a reconnaissance. Clayton's detachment further weakens the Confederate main line of resistance on the ridge. After the battle, when Stuart's doing his report, because, basically he suffered a defeat, and we're going to talk about that, he calculated that his main line on the ridge, and we're talking about a very thin, very long line, had 1,774 men after the detachment of the 600 Georgians, Clayton's brigade, and that portion of Straw's brigade that is down halfway down and all the way down the side of the ridge. 1,774 men to hold the line over a mile in length in a single rank. Hooker, in the meantime, prepares to advance up the ridge against Stuart's flank. And so now we need to go to the 4 o'clock map. And you can see what the alignment is at that time. Wims and Oosterhouse is pressed through the gap and starts moving up from the eastern side of the ridge. Cruft, Oosterhouse is from the Army of the Tennessee, the Vicksburg men. Cruft, who is an Army of the Cumberland man, is going straight up the spine of the ridge. And then if you'll look, Gary is on the western side of the ridge. It turns out, Gary, the ridge is really, really, really steep at that point. So while Gary is there, there's not much he can do about it because he can't really get up the ridge very easily. Advancing towards these so Cruft moves up between them, moves directly north up the ridge from Rossville Gap, and advancing towards those entrenchments that they had manned themselves. Cruft's men themselves had manned those entrenchments after the desperate days after the Battle of Chickamauga. So again, remember, the entrenchments that are up there in this particular area to cover the gap are facing east. And Confederate troops are marching on their reconnaissance, and they're coming south. So what they would need for them to be able to use those entrenchments against this force moving up would for these entrenchments to be oriented to the south, and they're not. They're oriented to the east. Breckinridge expects to find the 42nd and 43rd Georgia to be still holding Rossville, and sends one of his staff officers, who happens to be his son Cable, riding ahead to make contact. Cable does not find the 42nd or the 43rd, he finds the 9th, as in the 9th Iowa, Williamson's brigade of Oosterhouse's division. He makes a valiant effort to escape. He's riding a very fine, remember these are guys from Kentucky and they're elites in Kentucky. He rides a very fine thoroughbred mare, Fanny, trying to escape. But in the end, Fanny becomes the property of General Oosterhouse rather than of Cable, and Cable becomes a prisoner. Clayton's men, in the meantime, expect to find Georgians in the gap, and they move out not in battle order but by the flank, but they do have skirmishers out. The skirmishers, who are men from the 36th Alabama, see a mass of troops in the gap, but soon find out that they're wearing blue, not the gray that the Georgians should be wearing. And just coming up the ridge is Charles Cruft, this time leading the 9th Indiana as opposed to the 9th Iowa. And the rebel skirmishers open fire, scattering Cruft and his staff back through the lines of Indiana men. But the 9th colonel, a fellow by the name of Isaac Suman, quickly gets his men into hand and forces the skirmishers back. The onrushing advance of the Yankees requires Breckinridge and Holtzcall to deploy the Alabama brigade into a line of battle, which they managed to do in sort of a confused way. 2 regiments get deployed, but 2 others seem to be missing, having been separated from the column during the march down. Holtzclaw rides off to find them, while Breckinridge stays with the men in the front. Each side is in a race to get into a solid line of battle, and the Federals succeed first. Cruft's lead brigade is able to get a 2-regiment front moving up the ridge, with Joe Hooker himself riding out not far behind. The Confederates fall back into this line of breastworks, but again, they're facing east, not south, and so they don't do them very well. Therefore, they are not able to hold on very long, and so they are forced back to a second line of breastworks, which are oriented a little bit more to the south, and they were able to resist Cruft's advance, especially when the Federals stopped to reorganize and bring up reinforcements. In the meantime, there's a threat to the Confederate left. Down on the eastern side of the ridge, Oosterhouse's men are moving in a diagonal fashion, and again, you can look at the 4 p.m. map and you can see how they're oriented in a diagonal fashion going up the ridge. Actually, that diagonal advance suits the Confederates in the sense that their entrenchments are oriented to the east there, because it really, Oosterhouse is moving up from the east. Eventually, Wood's men start lapping around the Confederate flank, and that's one of the 2 brigades that Oosterhouse has, further imperiling the Alabama brigade. Now let's put a hold on it for a minute, and let's go back and think what's going on the rest of Missionary Ridge. Sherman's attack on the northern end of the ridge failed. The terrain was difficult. Bragg had the weight of his army. Remember, he had 5 of his 8 divisions in that on that northern end, and they're under General Hardee, and he's got the best Confederate division in the Army right there to General Claiborne's division. Grant had already determined to order the Army of the Cumberland, again in the center, to assault the rifle pits at the base of the center of the ridge as a diversion to help Sherman, once he knew that Hooker had passed Rossville Gap. Hooker had not done a good job of keeping Grant informed about that, but the time was such that Grant decided it was time to try that diversion about 3:40 in the afternoon. 6 signal guns at that time, 3:40 on Orchard Knob, filed signaling the 4 divisions of the Army of the Cumberland to advance towards the rebel center. They start a sequence of events that would seal the fate of Clayton's brigade way down in the Rossville area, soon to be locked in a struggle for survival that far down the ridge. As originally ordered, Stewart's division was intended to cover a front from a point about 100 yards south of Bragg's headquarters. And if you look, you can see Bragg's headquarters marked on the 4 p.m. map. There's a bigger red dot right in that area. That's the general area of Bragg's headquarters. But as the Federals advance, someone notices that the interval in front of Bragg's headquarters is actually undefended. Bragg dispatched it, remember, because Stewart's men have been moving up and down the ridge all day long, and there's been confusion created by exactly how we're going to set them out. Bragg dispatches Tennessee Governor Isham G. Harris, who is acting as a volunteer aide, to deploy some troops in his front. And he goes to Stewart's rightmost unit, Gibson's Louisiana Brigade, and orders them to sidestep 100 yards to the right. Well, okay, if Gibson's moving to the right, but no one, Strahl is the next one, and they're not moving, what happens? That 100-yard gap is just moved in between Gibson and Strahl. Gibson gets there right in time as the Federals are coming up the ridge, but his move made a gap in Stewart's front, as I just mentioned. Stewart posted artillery in that gap, but soon it ran out of ammunition. And then there's some Florida troops are retreating up the mountain, and Stewart intercepts a regiment or 2 of them and tries to use them to plug the gap, but they're demoralized and they don't hold. The rest of Stewart's division is doing pretty good, especially Stovall's brigade on the division's extreme left. And again, we can see where Stovall was on the 4 p.m. map, about halfway up the side of the ridge. They had been surrendered. They were facing Carlin's brigade of Johnson's division, the Army of the Cumberland, the rightmost of this 4 division advance in the center. Stovall's men who'd been surrendered to Vicksburg, like I said, were getting their first chance for payback, and were doing it quite well. They overlapped the Federals, advancing against them by 50 or 75 yards. They had the assistance of a battery. You can see a little red hitch right below where Stovall is. That's where this battery's talking about, and it's shooting on into Confederates, into Carlin's flank there. And the ridge is steeper there. Plus, these men didn't stay in the geographic crest entrenchments. Instead, they moved forward to the military crest and started shooting downhill. So Carlin is stopped cold by Stovall. But back up on the right, Gibson finds that the Federals have penetrated not only the ridge to his right, but also his ridge to the left. And so he's forced to leave the ridge. The next unit down to the south of Gibson is Otho F. Strahl, who's a name we remember here from the Battle of Franklin. Strahl is flanked by Gibson having to leave, and so he has to leave, and eventually Stovall's brigade is forced to leave too because they're being flanked. Carlin, therefore, is able to get to the top of the ridge, and he detaches from his brigade the 2nd Ohio Regiment and directs them to a height about 300 yards to the south, which I believe is where that battery, the Confederate battery is, where we see the hatches on the mountain. It is likely the height from which that battery had been firing. Witnesses commented particularly on the enormous sound which roared through the cold, clear afternoon on the east side of Missionary Ridge. Oosterhouse's men could hear the racket of the firing on the main battle line. With Cruft's men in the front, Holtzclaw determined that the most serious threat to his brigade's safety was Oosterhouse's advance up from the left side, from the east side of the ridge. He sent Breckinridge a message asking for assistance and was told that the main line had given away and collapsed, and Holtzclaw must get his men away. And so now let's go to the 5 p.m. map. And you can see from the 5 p.m. map that there's not much of an escape route left for Holtzclaw's men. Let me get oriented here real quick, I'm sorry. Holtzclaw tried to make an orderly withdrawal with the men of his own 18th Alabama Regiment covering the retreat, but the brigade started to give way, and Holtzclaw later wrote, "Seeing themselves nearly surrounded by 10 times their own number, discipline and courage were gone, and the greater portion of the command ran out like a mob, each endeavoring to be the foremost. This Alabama brigade is almost trapped. You've got the 2nd Ohio up on the north end of the ridge, blocking their retreat that way. You've got the Gary's division keeping them from going off to the west, not that they'd want to anyway, and Oosterhouse angling up from the east. There's just one little area off to basically the northeast that allows a corridor for escape. Captain Ben Lane Posey of the 36th Alabama was doing his best to get away. He tried to go along the west side of the ridge away from Oosterhouse in an effort to rejoin the main body of the army. Almost exhausted, he sees a group of men at the top who are gathering darkness, appear to be wearing gray. And finding himself in a group of Confederates, he shouts in joy that he was safe at last. And an officer wearing blue asks if he had surrendered. It was Carlin himself. The Federal vice closes, and Oosterhouse shouts that if had more hours of daylight, they would have destroyed the rebel army. And when you think about it, that was truly a possibility. And we'll talk about that in a minute. The remnants of Holtzclaw's command retreated to a pontoon bridge over the Chickamauga. Stewart's in command of that crossing and holds it until about 2 o'clock in the morning the next morning to allow as many stragglers as could get across. Of the 1,500 men of Holtzclaw's brigade who went into action that day, 810 are casualties, including 700 prisoners. And the flags of the 18th, 36th, and 38th Alabama regiments are captured. For the Confederates, it's a mortifying and unexpected defeat. But as time went on and they were able to reflect, it became clear what happened to Holtzclaw's men could have happened to a much larger segment of the Army. One of Breckinridge's staff officers noted that it was fortunate that the main line gave way, the main line in front of the Army of the Cumberland gave way when it did, or else this the corps-sized force of hookers coming in from behind could have cut off the whole Confederate left. For the second day in a row, Joe Hooker had the most spectacular victory, overshadowed though by the larger triumph of the Army of the Cumberland's spontaneous advance up the side of Missionary Ridge. A.P. Stewart, like Breckinridge's officer, recognized the defeat could have been much worse. But unlike the officer, Stewart, who was a Presbyterian elder, did not see the escape as fortunate, but saw it as the effect of the overruling hand of a gracious providence. So regardless of escaping a greater disaster, it was still a defeat. And for the Army of Tennessee, something that's familiar, the only hope was to regroup and try to do a better another day. So thank you for your attention, and if anybody's got any questions, I'll be glad to.
Just in terms of orientation, where's the modern highway in relation? Would it be on this map?
You mean the interstate over?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. If you're going up Missionary Ridge and you get up to the top and you're heading east, then right up on the hill to the right is Bragg's headquarters. Okay? There used to be an observation tower there years ago that's now, believe it or not, a fire tower up on the plateau in Middle Tennessee. But that's basically where it was. And if you go along Missionary Ridge today, again, if you look at the markers put up by the War Department at that time are wrong because they don't show Stovall's men, Stovall's brigade being divided. There's a Stovall, and the marker's out of place a little bit too, in Clayton's brigade, and there's no mention of that 600 men at Rossville Gap. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, what actually went wrong? Were they just outnumbered or outfought or?
Well, you had, Clayton's brigade had 1,500 men, and you have 10,000 Yankees. And so, and plus they were kind of surprised. Remember, they're going on a reconnaissance. We're going to go feel out and see where the Yankees are, and the Yankees are expecting to find Confederates there, but they're not. Although the initial shock had them a little bit surprised, but they had the men there to do it, and so it's basically being outnumbered and outflanked. Remember, they're boxed in, except for that. If you look at the 5 o'clock map, there's just one little corridor for there to be an escape, and I've got an arrow showing how that escape took place. 800 men, 700 prisoners. Yes, sir.
I was intrigued by what you said about the Confederates never, or not never, but missed the military crest often. And I find that very intriguing because you had a lot of, West Point graduates.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting point. Any reason for that, do you think, or just what pace?
I think they're, in the context of Shies Hill and Missionary Ridge, they're kind of in a hurry. And probably didn't have engineers to sketch things out. Instead, we just moved to the top of the, remember at Shies Hill, they retreat up there after a long, hard day of fighting. They're in the dark, all that sort of stuff. And so maybe that's a little understandable. Again, Bragg should have laid out his lines on Missionary Ridge a long time before he did. And the men who were there, and had another deficiency the Confederates had at that time, is that they didn't have any shovels. I mean, or they didn't have enough to rapidly put a line in. And so the best account for that is there was a South Carolina officer by the name of Arthur Middleton Manigault, who was wounded here at Franklin, as I recall. And Manigault had a nice memoir after the war, and he talked in some detail about Chattanooga and how the engineers really didn't lay things out. And again, that was even true with Stovall's guys. Stovall's guys got up out of their trenches and went and shot down the ridge. It's just a phenomenon. What happened at Cheatham Hill, I don't know. You should have thought, but remember, if you go to Cheatham Hill, and those of you who have been there, the Federals had a massive assault up the side of Cheatham Hill, and didn't take it. But then they were down like the Confederate lines right here, and they're down like this right below. And actually, they tried to tunnel up under there to get to the Confederate line. So that was just a problem they had. And of course, the Army of Tennessee had plenty of problems. That just happened to be one of them. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
I do have a question. As far as General Hooker's actions at Rossville Gap, does it change some of his superiors' perception of him compared to what he dealt with early on in the war?
Well, his superior at that time is Ulysses Grant and William T. Sherman. Well, Sherman becomes his superior, and I don't think so. But if you think about Hooker in this time period that he's in the West, he really doesn't do a bad job.
Yeah.
He's really a pretty good commander. He commands a corps, the 20th Corps, which is basically not the 20th Corps of the Army of the Cumberland that fought at Chickamauga, but it's basically the troops from the 11th and 12th Corps that he brought from the Army of the Potomac, and they just combine them and make them a new corps. But he attacks at New Hope Church. He's got a successful attack and defense at Resaca. He does a pretty decent job. But for whatever reason, he's poisoned the well and resigns in disgust, I think, when McPherson is killed in the Battle of Atlanta on July 22nd. and he's expecting to get the control of the Army of the Tennessee, and they give it to Oliver Otis Howard. And if you know anything about Hooker and Oliver Otis Howard, you know that Hooker was in command of the Army of the Potomac at Chancellorsville, and the corps that gave way to Stonewall Jackson's attack was Oliver Otis Howard's corps. So, you know, this guy who created my disaster now, you know, gets the command instead of me. Anyone else? I hope that taught you something about Chattanooga you didn't know. And no one can say, well, I know more than you do, like you would if it's Spring Hill. So thank you for your attention. We're good? All right.